This is a wonderful opportunity for us all to engage two spectacular American minds in a discussion of education reform in the country, Senator Rubio and Secretary Rice. Before we get going, let me just say to all of you, welcome to Washington. You've come at a very chilly moment. The one advantage to being in Washington is you don't need a weatherman. If you really want to know how cold it is, you just look at all the politicians walking around with their hands in their own pockets, and you know it's cold. That's for you, Governor. And this is a very warm event in the sense that it's about America's children. It's about improving the quality of education. No matter your political affiliation, no matter your race, no matter your class, this is a matter of great concern for this generation of American leadership. That's why you're here. Let me briefly tell you a story. I wrote a biography of Justice Marshall, and in order to do the book, I spent 6 months interviewing him. At the end of the 6-month period, I went up to the Supreme Court and I took with me a piece that appeared in the Law Journal that said Justice Marshall had made a terrible mistake in 1954, 60 years ago this year, in arguing the Brown case because he argued for racial integration and not for quality schools for all children. I was reluctant to brace him at his age with such a tough question about whether he had made a mistake all those years before, but I decided I wanted to ask this question. And I didn't say to him that the man who had written the piece was named Clarence Thomas. And Justice Marshall looked at me and said, you know, he never intended to create some rainbow of colors in the classroom, that the theory, the necessary theory was that if the white majority controlling school boards, superintendents, school systems, the politicians knew that schools were to be integrated, they would feel the need to create quality schools for all children. And I said, but look out the door, Justice Marshall. We live with hyper-segregation, especially in big city schools. We live with poor quality education for so many children that leaves them suffering from achievement gaps, high dropout rates. And I think it's not being indiscreet to say to you, the man began to tear up. And so as we gather tonight, we are talking about carrying on a mission that goes across American history and that has tremendous import. It's why we're here today. It's why this is such a critical meeting at this time, to talk about the future of education reform. So Secretary Rice, let me turn to you as someone who grew up in the segregated South and ask you about your experience, because literally you know and grew up with people who died fighting in that cause.
I did indeed, and thank you very much, Juan, for being here with us. And Senator Rubio, I look forward to our conversation. And I just said I'm so inspired when I'm here at the summit, because you come from all over the country with one cause in mind, and that's to make sure that every child has a high-quality education. There's nothing more important. I do have to note that Brown versus the board and I are exactly the same age. It was 1954, and yes, I am now 60 as of last week. And the interesting thing is that the interesting thing about this is that I was born in Birmingham, Alabama, and I went to segregated schools until my parents and I moved to Denver when I was 12. Despite the fact that Brown said that it couldn't be separate but equal, we in fact had segregated schools in Alabama. What's very interesting, though, is that we had outstanding teachers. We had an insistence on high standards and excellence for the students. And people put everything into their kids. And I think that formula is no different today, whether we're talking about schools that are integrated or not. We have to have the same expectations for our students and for our teachers. And I could give you chapter and verse about the incredibly accomplished people that came out of those segregated schools in Birmingham. In fact, when we moved to Denver, Colorado, my parents thought that the Denver schools were behind the segregated schools that I had gone to in Birmingham, and for the first time they sent me to private schools. It just tells you something about that atmosphere. Our challenge today, though, is to take the great civil rights principles, the great civil rights commitment that we had in the 1960s, and to make sure that we recognize today that those who died, like my friend Denise McNair, a little girl in that church in Birmingham, those who struggled for equality, I think would be disappointed today in what is available to minority kids and to poor kids. And so it is our challenge now to win the new civil rights struggle. And the new civil rights struggle is a high quality education for every child.
That's very well said. Senator Rubio, let me bring you into the conversation. When your family came here in the 1950s, what did they say to you about growing up in American culture and being educated in American schools?
Well, I didn't really get to talk to them until the 1970s. But first, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be with so many of you. You know, what's interesting, I think, is if you compare the era my parents came to the U.S. They came in 1956. My father, his mom died when he was 9 years old. So he went to work the day after she died and would work for the next 70 years. My mother had parents who went to bed hungry at night so that they wouldn't. They had no privilege, no power, no status in Cuba. They came to the U.S. literally with probably no more than a 4th or 5th grade education. And they struggled their first years here. But they persevered, and they were able to achieve the American dream working as a bartender and a maid. That's what the 20th century made possible. Compare that to the 21st century now, and I say this without any doubt. If my parents had arrived here in 1996 or 2006 instead of 1956, they would have struggled to achieve the lifestyle, the American dream, the way you can achieve it today. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But one of the reasons is those jobs that once sustained that, those high or middle income, low skill jobs have vanished. And in the 21st century, to fill those new middle skill jobs will be created, but they will require a higher level of education than ever before. So education has always been a good thing to have, an essential thing to have for certain careers. Today, it is a complete and absolute necessity. People talk about the gap between the haves and have-nots in America today. The gap is between those that have some form of advanced education and some that do not. I think we made a terrible mistake 25, 30 years ago in stigmatizing career education and telling people that if you're not going to go to a 4-year college, you can't succeed. When in fact we know that there are now going to be millions of middle skill jobs that require more than high school but less than college. Another opportunity we have before us is to redefine what it means to go to high school, to actually be able to leave high school with something that allows you to go to work the next day, to be industry certified in some career. We need to find alternatives for people that have to work full-time and raise a family, but are 30 credits short of graduating. Or, you know, the single mom was a receptionist, making $9 or $10 an hour. We need to help her become a dental hygienist so she can make $35 an hour. But how's she going to do that if she has to work full-time and raise a family? All of that, of course, begins at the early stages of life. The foundation that allows any of these things to be possible for you is a quality K through 12 education. And it is immoral and outrageous that the only people in America today that do not choose where their children go to school are poor people. The only people in America. It is un-American. We are a nation that has distinguished itself across history by equality of opportunity. There is no equality of opportunity if a parent cannot put their kids in the school of their choice in the best environment possible because they don't make enough money.
Well, let me just break this conversation down as we start out in explicit racial terms. Because if you look at outcomes right now
for Black and Hispanic students in the US school systems, there's a tremendous deficit. The question becomes one of remedy. How do you go about fixing this situation? What you experience when you become an advocate for school reform is resistance from people who say 90+% of American children still go to public schools, and yet you are opening the door to school choice, you're opening the door to vouchers, you're opening the door to all sorts of alternatives to public schools. Are you stealing funds, resources from public schools? Are you somehow taking away respect and admiration for the American school teacher?
I'm a great believer in public schools and public education. It's one of the foundational institutions of our democracy. But who are we kidding? The problem today is that we have a public school system that is in its very essence unequal. If you are a parent or a family of relative means, you will move to a place, a district, where the schools are good. That's why houses are expensive in Palo Alto, where I live. That's why houses are expensive in Fairfax County near here. That's why they're expensive in Hoover, Alabama, right outside of Birmingham. If you are really of means, you will send your kid to a private school. And so who's stuck in failing neighborhood schools? Poor kids, many of whom are minority kids. So we already have an opt-out system in the public school system. And all that those of us who believe in school choice are saying is give parents who don't otherwise have the means a chance to send their children to a school that might work for them. Now, we've got many public opportunities. Charter schools are oversubscribed because so many of them serve children very, very well. In parts of the country, the ability to go to a school district where your child is going to get to opt out into a school district. So it's not the abandonment of public schools. And I don't think there's a person in this room who would say we shouldn't do everything that we can to fix the public schools. We need to have higher quality teachers. We need to have better trained people in the classroom. There's a lot of work to do on the public schools. But in the meantime, we can't afford to lose generation after generation of kids on the altar of, well, they have to stay in the public schools to which they are assigned. We just can't afford to lose those kids because we do know this. If you don't read by the time you're in 3rd grade, you're probably not going to read. So we're not losing kids every 18 years. We're losing them by the time they're 8 or 9 years old. And my remedy is, yes, high quality teachers, yes, better after school programs, yes, early childhood education, all of those remedies. But school choice is a near-term intervention to prevent the further deterioration of the circumstances of so many children who are currently trapped in those bad schools.
Well, let me say a couple things. I have 4 school teachers in my family. So Thanksgiving's going to be very interesting, but always is. No, but all kidding aside, teachers are not our problem at the end of the day. Teachers are sacrificial, many of whom become personally invested in the lives and the stories of their students who are struggling. And so I think that's important to say. You talked about the school saying we're taking away money from them. It depends on how you look at it. That money doesn't belong to the school. That money belongs to the kids. The reason why we spend money on education is to spend on children. And that's a first way to view it. The second point I would make is some of the best schools in Florida are public schools. Some of the best schools in Florida are public schools. Some of the worst public schools are some of the worst schools we have are public schools. But some of our best schools are public schools. You can succeed in a public school setting. And then you talked a little bit about these demographics that you've outlined in the results. I would view it this way. If a child, we have to be honest about this. If a child is born into a broken family, living in substandard housing, and condemned by zip code to attend a failing school, that child is going to struggle to succeed unless something happens to break that cycle and change the course. One of the things that has to happen is they have to have the opportunity to get into a better learning environment. And a better learning environment means different things for different people. Some parents may want to put them in a faith-based school. Some may want to put them in a school that specializes in something the child has an interest in, whatever it may be. The problem is they don't have those choices. So that's why I honestly believe that we need to, the federal government loves to tell people what to do with money, I would love the federal government to turn over more of the money to states to allow the states to design innovative ways to use Title I or Head Start to provide choices. And here's the other, and I know that it's now being sued, but they're going to lose in Florida, I hope, to throw out the corporate scholarship program that's been such a great success. I would like to see us create one as well at the federal level where companies, in lieu of paying federal corporate taxes, can pay into a qualified scholarship organization so they too can give scholarship to needy families to put children in the school of their choice, not the government's choice.
Secretary Rice, that was such an interesting point that Senator Rubio raised about the money really being for the child.
Right.
And the question then becomes, if you give the money to the parent and say to the parent, you have a choice. Here's a menu of options. Can you trust that parent to do a better job than the public education system as it stands today, in which the money goes to the school, not the child? What do you think?
Well, I have always found it an interesting argument that poor parents don't really know what to do for their kids. You hear this. Right? Maybe they themselves are not educated. They don't really understand the school. Look, my parents my mom was a school teacher. My father was a high school guidance counselor, later on a university administrator. I fully admit that my parents were very comfortable in the kind of educational milieu. It was everything I could do to keep my parents from coming to the school every day to do something for me. But it is such a mistaken impression that poor parents either don't care or don't know what is best for their kids. In East Palo Alto, East Menlo Park, and Redwood City, an area near Stanford, literally across the railroad tracks from Stanford, where it's a very underserved area, some friends and I started many years ago, and it's now a program of the Boys and Girls Club, something called Center for New Generation. It's an after-school enrichment program and a summer program for kids. They do high-quality math, science, they do instrumental music, and it's an after-school program because one of the problems we have is we still have one of the shortest learning days and shortest learning years of any industrialized country in the world. So we have to find ways to extend the learning day. This is a very poor area. Those parents line up around the block to put their kids into this program. It's just that these parents don't have good options. And so I would trust the parent, especially when I see what happens when a kid, as Senator Rubio said, is assigned by zip code. I know what that movie looks like. So I would much rather let the parent have a chance to get the kid into a better learning environment. Now, there are times when parents are not capable of making those decisions for their children. We know of parents who are simply not present or not functioning. But then there are surrogates who can help. Maybe it's the minister in the community. In our community, the churches were real centers of education with tutoring and pastors who literally went door to door to make sure that kids were going to school. So maybe it's the minister. Maybe it's somebody at the YMCA or at the Boys and Girls Club. But there needs to be an adult advocate for that child. And that adult advocate, preferably the parent, should have a say in where that child goes to school. Because right now we know what's happening when the government assigns that child to a school. They're going to substandard schools. And you may have seen a very interesting article a few days ago with the Justice Department beginning now to look at questions of whether or not teachers are being equitably distributed so that you are getting really high quality teachers into public schools. If we are finding that teachers are not equitably distributed, that the best teachers are going into schools where the neighborhoods have parents of means, we're really doubling down on failure for poor kids. And so I'll trust the parent or an advocate for that child.
And Secretary, that's an interesting point, to trust the parent. In a sense, what you're both agreeing on here is power to the parents, power to the child, and moving that power focus. The question becomes, I think, from the critic's point of view, are you taking money away? Now, you say you're not taking money away necessarily
It doesn't
from the
belong
public.
to them. It's not their money.
But that's your premise. But obviously now that's where the money's located.
Well, they're a provider. The reason why we have schools is not to employ people that work in them. We do want to employ people that work in them, but that's not why we built them. We built them to teach kids. And so we have to put them in the best environment for them to learn. Look, these things are best understood by the real stories of real people, okay? One story in particular. I know a young lady. She is the mother of a child that plays a sport with one of my sons. Things haven't gone well in her life. When she was very young, she got pregnant with her son. The father of her children has long disappeared. She didn't finish high school, so she has a very limited education. She struggles every month to pay the bills. She's one of these folks that every 2 weeks, when it gets to Thursday, Wednesday, Thursday night, you're just hoping that one check you wrote on Wednesday doesn't get there before the paycheck does on Friday kind of thing. It's tough. But let me tell you what's changed her life. Her child goes to a faith-based school. Now, that's not for everybody, but this child is going to a faith-based school. This child in that faith-based school has not just been exposed to reading and writing and learning, but also has grown in their faith. This child has been exposed to things like Close-Up and new programs that have opened up their horizons. Suddenly, this child believes that they can be anything they want to be. They've now been exposed to things they never would have been exposed to had they remained in the environment that they were in. You are literally expanding the horizons of somebody who in the future may aspire to bigger and better dreams they may have never even known was available to them. And that's just one story. There are tens of thousands every day of stories like that throughout the state of Florida and across the country. This notion that somehow someone at the Department of Education or a superintendent, and all who work hard, I imagine, most who work hard, I imagine, that they somehow are going to love and care about that child more than that child's mother, that's ridiculous. And I think that, look, most Americans would agree on this, and I think we've reached a point now where this issue has translated into a bipartisan issue. That there really is no longer, there are special interests that continue to spend money to prevent it moving forward, but I believe that there is from where this issue was 15 years ago when it started in Florida to where it is today, has been dramatic in terms of the gains that we have made across multiple communities, especially those who have most been impacted by the ability to choose where their children go to school. I don't think there's any way to turn this back, and I think our job now is to improve it and help it to work better so it can reach more people.
And people who say that you're taking money from the school, I completely agree with Senator Rubio. But then what can the school do? Well, the school could get better.
That's right.
The school could find new leadership. The school could begin to actually educate those children so that they stay. The children shouldn't have to be prisoner of the school so that the school could stay in business. And so I would hope that we introduce competition, if you will, into the public school system. I come out of the tertiary system. I'm a professor at Stanford. The great thing that the university system has in the United States, from community colleges to great research universities to liberal arts colleges, is we have variety so that somebody can be in an environment that is best for them. Maybe you want to go to a small college where your classes are going to be 20 people. Maybe you want to go to a huge state research institution where your experience is going to be very different, but you have variety. Secondly, you have competition. If you are a university that can't compete for students pretty soon, you're probably going to be out of business. And so introducing competition in that sense into the public school arena will make some schools decide that they're going to get better. And there are many examples of schools that have been turned around when you get new leadership. We know that principals are probably the single most important factor in how well a school performs. And so you bring in a new principal, you give that principal means and resources, you give that principal options and choices. You don't saddle that principal, by the way, with so many demands on the resources that the principal can't be innovative within the school. And there are so many stories of principals that have turned schools around. And then you don't have to worry about those kids taking a voucher or a scholarship and going someplace else.
And can I give you an example of one of those schools? In Miami, Florida, there's a school named Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington historically was the African-American school during segregation era. After that, it closed. It became a middle school. It became a high school a few years ago, and it struggled. It is located in Overtown, which is one of the poorest, most challenged communities that we have in South Florida. Every demographic indicator should tell you that that school should be a failing school, a school that isn't progressing, a school whose students aren't going to college, a school whose kids are dropping out. It is a majority, in fact, it is almost entirely a minority school made up of pretty evenly divided between Hispanics, not Cubans necessarily, but people coming from recent arrivals from Latin America, Central America, South America, and African American students. As the principal likes to say, the only thing these kids have in common is poverty. They all come from very poor backgrounds. This school is succeeding. This school, you know, it did things like bring in City Year, which is part of AmeriCorps, and where young Americans, after a year graduating, are giving a year of their life to go into these schools and serve as mentors and guide people. The pride these students have in the school. They also happen to have the national championship football team, so we're proud of that as well. But beyond it, and they're successful. And they have turned lives around. And there are kids that are leaving that school and going to college. And I wish people could interact with these young men and women that are graduating from there and the things they're going to be doing over the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years of their lives. Because they're led by a great leader. William Aristide is their principal. He's a phenomenal leader who cares about these kids, but also makes no excuses for them. He believes every single one of them is capable of succeeding. He believes every single one of them is capable of learning, and he insists on it. He is not going to fall into the idea that somehow, because they are come from a challenging background, they can't succeed as much as somebody else. Because he believes in them, because he has expectations in them, because he runs that school as if they all came from a privileged background in terms of the expectations of their learning. The kids believe it too. And that's an example of a public school that is succeeding, despite being in a neighborhood that says it should be failing.
Now, both of you have pointed to principles as key to success. And the example, the real-life example that you offered us, Senator Rubio, and you, Secretary Rice, in talking about what you can see in terms of schools that work. The question I have for the two of you is the opposition. The opposition would come to you and say, well, there are only so many good principals, there are only so many good teachers. You are essentially creating a marketplace of competition that will draw the best principals, the best teachers, into a small, select number of schools, and you'll leave behind the mass of students. So you'll leave behind people in general who are going to be ill-served in the environment that you are creating. I would even point out to you, Secretary Rice, that given the history, the very racial history around education in our country, people would note the segregationist academies that were formed after Brown, private schools. Would we be creating new segregationist academies essentially by offering vouchers and choice?
Well, what do we have right now? We have a too large percentage of our kids, particularly poor kids and minority kids, who are failing. And they're not failing because they are not potentially very bright kids. They're not failing because their parents, mother doesn't care. They're failing because they're in schools that are serving them badly. And we know that's an unacceptable percentage. Now, I may not be able to do something about every child. It may be too big a task. That's my goal, is to do something about every child. But I'm happy to begin to do something about more of them today. And if, in fact, I can save some percentage of that percentage, then I have achieved something. So yes, there are still going to be some kids who are, quote, left in those schools. And as I've said, you've got to go after those schools. You've got to improve the leadership of those schools. You've got to get better teachers into those schools. We've got to produce more teachers of quality and leadership of quality. Here, I believe that our education schools, university education schools, really have something to account for. They're not as much in the game of helping to produce good leadership for the schools. Now, I'll tell you a very good sign. As I said, I teach at Stanford. You get into Stanford, it means you are among the country's educational elite. In the 10 years since I was in government and returned back to Stanford, there are more kids who are trying to get in to teach for America. There are more kids who want to go to school and education and teach. It's surprising to me the degree to which this is turning, that the profession of teaching is becoming a preferred profession because young people are beginning to understand that it is critical to the country's development and they want to be a part of that. So they're out there. Teachers can be recruited, they can be trained. Principals can be recruited, they can be trained. We just have to make it a profession that is not just admired, but where innovation is allowed. Now, I have a cousin who teaches, and she'll be at Thanksgiving dinner. And she teaches in a very poor district. She's a master teacher, outstanding teacher. Every day, she just comes home kind of beaten up. By her students? No. By the bureaucracy. By the overlay of requirements. By the fact that she can't be innovative. That's what we need to release, is this innovative energy in our teachers, and we'll get more of the schools.
Just to add to that point, a lot of the kids that go into City Year, they aren't supposed to be there for a year. That's why it's called City Year. Right. They try to turn it into City Years. They want to stay for a second year and a third year. They become passionate. The second point, this is not true in all states and in all districts, but if you went to a local school district in many parts of this country and told them you wanted to teach journalism, they would tell you you're not qualified, you're not certified. Some other people might say that too about me. My point is that I think that needs to be opened up a little bit. The other aspect is if you do have more choices, more opportunities for people to teach, you elevate the teaching profession, more people will go into it. Again, they know they're not going to get rich off of it. They do it for, they have to pay their bills and make a living, but they do it because they have a passion for that. I would make one other point, because you raised the issue of the schools and whether we're going to have a de facto segregation situation. I would say twofold. In many parts, without school choice, that's actually what you have. Because we segregate by zip code. We pretend that they're race neutral, but we know who lives in the zip codes. And you're telling people they can only go to school in that zip code or in that zoned area. That's what you've in essence done. And here's a dirty secret. It's not so secret anymore. And I'll give you a real world example. Another high school in Miami, Miami Central High, a perpetually failing school for decades, was the place where the Dade County School District dumped their worst employees, their worst teachers, their worst janitors, their worst administrators. They dumped them into schools like that. They put them there. Now, that's been turned around, luckily, over the last few years. But that was a deliberate thing that they did. If a teacher didn't want to work, if someone was just there to finish out their last 5 years before retirement, if they had marks on their record, they pushed them all into schools like that. That happened too, and I suspect in many parts of the country is still occurring. And that's immoral. That's wrong. That needs to be prevented as well. I think when you have choice, and you give those choice to parents to put their kids in the best environment, they're no longer trapped there. They have opportunities to go somewhere else, and we'd expose that sort of practice sooner.
Now, for both of you, one of the issues that's central to this meeting, of course, has to do with standards, testing, Common Core. There are people who resist this, who say that, in fact, you're trying to have the federal government tell people what they can do and what they can't do, that you are forcing too much testing on America's children, that it's the point of being oppressive. It's become a political issue. So the question is, how do you, as people who, as evident from your comments and your interest in this topic, but your comments here tonight, care deeply about education reform, how do you speak to people who say, I'm all for education reform, but I'm tired of this idea of more testing or Common Core standards?
Well, can I just answer, as a federal policymaker, my singular interest is to ensure that the federal government, the Department of Education, does not use any standards as a tool to beat up local districts and say, if you want funding, you have to do what we want you to do. People say that federal money comes with strings attached. It comes with chains attached. And I want to prevent that from happening. And that's my singular interest in that regard. And in terms of testing, look, I can tell you, I mean, when I was in the legislature, these issues used to come up, homework, testing, all these sorts of things. And my kids come home at night sometimes with a lot of homework. And they don't go to a public school, they go to a faith-based school. And so I get some of that when people say the testing, and then we get nervous every Thursday when my daughter has a test in this because we want her to do well, except now it's online, so you get it right away, so it's, it's even more stressful in that regard. But here's the flip side of it. If you don't measure, how do you know? Why do we keep score in a football game? If we don't measure things, then how do we know? And in fact, it tells people you don't care. And I think that there has to be a balance there. So yeah, if there's unnecessary testing going on, who's in favor of that? Except maybe a testing company, but who's in favor of unnecessary testing? Or putting people, we want them to learn too, not just be able to be a good test taker. But the flip side of it is at some point you have to measure it. And by the way, you're doing a great disservice to a child if they don't learn how to take tests and be successful at them, because they're going to need one to get into college if that's what they want to do. They're going to need one to be certified in a profession if that's what they want to do. They're going to need to do that if they want to become a lawyer or a doctor or anything else. The only thing you don't need to take a test for is to join Congress. But we're working on that. No, but my point is that you know, if you don't measure, then you don't care. And someone else, I think, maybe Governor Bush used to say that all the time. And I think that that's why it's still important that at the end of the day, there's got to be some measurement that we could look at and say, in the last 12 months or 10 months of the school year, this child went from knowing this to knowing this. How else do you have accountability?
Well, but you said you're opposed to the idea that there are chains attached to dollars that come from the federal government.
Yes.
So,
because you can't influence the federal government. If someone in a local district decides, I really don't like what they're teaching in my school, they can go to the school district. They may even be able to go to Tallahassee or your capital. You think they're going to be able to come up here and get into that building and navigate that? So I do think that the role of the federal government is to create incentives or funds that fund and help propel. But what I'm concerned about is that at some point it could be used, and that's my singular interest in that, and any other issue for that matter, that at some point it could be used to create the equivalent of a national school board by creating conditions on federal funding that basically supplant the independence of local school districts and states where the decisions should actually be made. And
right now what you're saying is that you see governors, you see school boards, localities basically, adopting standards and testing.
No, what I see is not about today. What I see is about tomorrow. The federal government has never been able to resist telling people what to do with the money they send you. On the contrary, I think we need to be moving in the opposite direction, whether, like I said, with Title I funding or Head Start funding, basically creating pools of money as a block grant and letting states create innovative programs. They can't help themselves but to tell you how to spend the money that they send you. Sometimes they try to tell you how to spend the money you yourself generated. And so I'm just telling you that for the federal bureaucracy, it is irresistible. No matter what the law may be today, it is irresistible to eventually use whatever to try to force people to do it their way. I'm just saying we need to be vigilant about it in the long term.
But you want that money and that power then back in the states.
States and school boards, absolutely.
In the states.
States and school boards.
And you would endorse the idea of a Common Core and testing.
Well, I've always believed in improving curriculum, and every state decides what their curriculum should be. In fact, when I was the Speaker of the House, the second phase of what we try to accomplish is to improve curriculum so that it's a 21st century curriculum. And in fact, the challenge moving forward is that because the 21st century is a time of such rapid change, you may have to constantly update that curriculum to not just keep in line with the realities of the new economy, but with the specific geographic advantages that your area might have. So for example, cattle farmers or people in the cattle industry, there's not a big market for them in Miami. If you wanted to go into agriculture, but there is in the hospitality industry, there is in international trade and commerce. So you may want to even have a curriculum that reflects your state's strategic advantages. And that's why I think we have to have the capability to have not just a solid curriculum, but the ability to constantly update it. But I believe that that power should rest with localities at the state and local level.
I agree with let me just say a word about testing, and I think Senator Rubio put it very well. You are going to be tested your entire life, and you need to get accustomed to it. I'm not talking about excessive testing. I'm not talking about teaching to the test. I'm one who believes that you want to teach kids how to think, and then they will do well on those tests. But the truth of the matter is, if you don't assess, not only do you not know what they are learning, you can't intervene to help them. The reason that you test is to say this student is still having problems with multiplication. This student is still having problems with complex division. That's why you test. And then, as a teacher, you can intervene. As a parent, perhaps you can intervene to help that student. So testing is a part of our world. And by the way, in every other country in the world, they test much more thoroughly and under much, much more pressure than our students do. Because in many countries in the world, if you don't if you don't pass that test, you are done with your education. And you are now going to go some other path.
That's an important perspective. Yeah. I mean, I was in South Korea last year, and one of the things they lament is how stressful it is for their students. Yes. But we're not advocating to get to that point. I mean, let's have some comparison here.
We are way below what it's like in many. Just to the question of standards or common standards or the Common Core, whatever you want to call it, we have a national problem, but the solutions will come locally. Our national problem is that our kids are not being well educated. We are falling behind as a country, further and further behind the rest of the industrialized world. We're 27th in this and 19th in that. Sooner or later, it's going to come back to haunt us that we are not really training our people for the skills of the 21st century, and it's going to show up in our economic competitiveness. It's going to show up in our social cohesion, because in the United States, since we're not held together by blood or ethnicity or nationality or religion, we're held together by this aspirational narrative. You know, you can come from humble circumstances, you can do great things, it had better be true, and with a sub-quality education, it's not true. And so we have a national problem. But there's no doubt that one of the great advantages of the American system is that it really is carried out in localities and in the states, and that's where it should reside. I do think, though, when you ask people, you know, should you have the same skills, not the same curriculum or the same substantive knowledge, but should you have the same skills for a third grader in Alabama, Texas, Georgia, Vermont, California? Yeah, they ought to be able to do the same thing by third grade. Because with labor mobility of the kind that we have in our country, because we're all citizens of this one country, you don't want a student in Alabama to be disadvantaged by not having met standards of the same quality of a kid from another state. Now, there are lots of ways to meet those standards, and the states and the localities ought to be able to determine how to meet those standards. But the idea that every third grader in America shouldn't be able to do complex division, it just seems to me rather odd. And so I think the debate has gotten a little misrepresented in some ways. Nobody wants Washington to dictate what's going to happen in our schools throughout our states. But we do, as a country, want to be sure that all of our people have the same skills so that they can move easily, so they can go to college anywhere, so they can be employed anywhere.
Now, this seems to me to be all in service to competition in education, that education reform, power to the parents in terms of the focus on the children and not job provision for the adults, is all about competition. The critics would say to the two of you, but when you look at charter schools today, even at some of the private schools, I should say, you don't see that there's any radical difference in terms of outcomes, in terms of testing outcomes, test scores, between the students involved. How do you respond?
Well, a couple things. First of all, I would say that at the end of the day, the parents have chosen to put them in that environment because it's not just the results of the test, but it's the learning environment that they're in. Maybe it's a specialty program that they're involved in. Whatever it may be, the parents have chosen to put them in that environment. And by the way, let me be clear about charter schools. There are very good charter schools that are doing extraordinary things. There are specialized charter schools that specialize in a particular curriculum. For example, I go back to my home state. The Latin Builders Association has started a charter school that teaches people in the construction trades. When you graduate, when you're in that school, a member of the Latin Builders will bring you on board after you go to school for 6 hours to work apprenticeship jobs with them. When you graduate from that school, if you graduate with a diploma and a job with one of the Latin Builder members in that charter school. Now, I don't know how you're going to measure that in the test, but I'm telling you, these are kids that are graduating and they're going to go to work. That's a successful charter school as an example. Now, there are good charter schools, and there are going to be charter schools that miss the mark. There's no silver bullets here. The point is that this is about giving people options and having that option available to them. And at the end of the day, if there's a better public school, a traditional public school in the neighborhood that's getting better outcomes than the charter school, the parents could switch back. There's nothing keeping them from doing that.
And there are some a lot of extraordinary charter schools. Yes, if you look and, everybody wants to take the average of everything. Let's look at the very best of them. Let's look at a broad variety of charter schools. Higher graduation rates. Kids are going to school in a safe environment. Kids are learning to actually pay attention in class. These are the intangibles that certain educational environments are providing. Faith-based schools, Catholic schools, higher graduation rates. Kids are in a safe environment. They're learning to pay attention in class. Now, when I hear people say, well, you're getting the same results in charter and private schools that you're getting in the lowest performing public schools, no, you're not.
Yeah,
I mean, nobody's making that argument. But that's sometimes the way that it's presented. So I think variety, yes, some of these experiments are going to succeed, some of them are not going to succeed. But what we do know is that the status quo isn't acceptable. And so we need to allow parents, when they know that their child is in an environment in which they're failing, to have other options. It's that simple. And choice is kind of the American way. People get to make those choices.
Now, in some court cases, the argument is made public dollars should not flow to private institutions and religious institutions.
Then
religious
take
schools.
away, and I say this advisedly because I went to school there, take away Notre Dame's Pell Grants, right? I don't get this argument. We support, at the tertiary level, we support faith-based and religious schools with federal dollars through federal funding of students through all means of financial aid. And so I see nothing wrong with a similar principle for secondary education.
By the way, that argument is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the Establishment Clause. The Establishment Clause was designed to prevent the establishment of an official religion that was mandated upon the people. There are countries that have an official religion. The United States does not. It was not in any way intended to exist as a barrier between interaction between government and religious-based institutions. And I think that that whole argument is based upon a flawed interpretation of the Constitution, including in a court case that for the first time introduced the notion of separation of church and state.
And by the way, I thought your earlier response, which was that the choice really is in the money with the child and the parents, would then take the state out of play here, because then it would be that you're simply funding the child's education and that the child and the parent are making the best choice in the best interest of that child's future. So I think that's another way to think about it.
You can throw up all kinds of arguments about why you shouldn't have the situation that you just described, school choice, the ability of the parent to make good choices. But the fact of the matter is, if you are a poor parent watching your kid warehoused in some of our worst public schools, that's got to be one of the hardest circumstances that a parent can possibly face. I've seen it. I've seen it in places. I got involved in East Palo Alto because I gave a commencement address for the Ravenswood School District. And I was just back from the government, and the superintendent asked me to give the address, so I did. And it was an eighth grade graduation. And I said to her, you know, this is an awfully elaborate commencement for eighth grade. And she said, that's because for 70% of these kids, this is their last commencement. Wow. They won't finish high school. Now, that's just unacceptable. And if you defend the status quo under those circumstances, you're condemning those kids to exactly that situation. And so there are lots of arguments out there, but keeping the status quo, simply, there's no good argument for that.
Well, one last point as we begin to wrap up here. Senator Rubio, you talked briefly before about problems with family formation in our time. If you look at the Hispanic community, about 50% of the children born to single-parent families. In the black community, it's 70% right now. And when it comes to early education, again, lots of barriers in the way, and people who say, well, it's not the responsibility of the government to be the parent. And you can't put that added financial burden on a school system without understanding that it impacts their ability to deliver services to all children. How do you feel about early childhood education, getting children in school at a very early age? And do you have any problem with people who say that's not the government's role?
No, first of all, in Florida we have that. We have a voluntary pre-kindergarten program in Florida. In fact, one of the teachers in my family, that's what they teach. I'm a believer in the role that it can play, and I think there's nothing wrong with government being involved in, I mean, what you're talking about is starting kindergarten 1 or 2 years early, in essence. And we know that there can be incredible gains made in learning in those early years. And the concern that we have is the following. Already, it goes back to the same problem. In America today, affluent families do have children in early education settings at 2, 3, or 4 years of age. Poor families have them in daycare centers, where they're basically warehoused, they're fed, they get to play, but no one is teaching them anything. That is a significant disadvantage. We do have government programs that address that. We have Head Start programs. The problem is they operate under federally guided mandates. They should be opened up and block granted to the states, so the states and local communities could design flexible programs that meet the needs of their particular geography or whatever it is, the circumstances that they're facing in their individual communities. But at the end, look, schools don't raise children. Families raise children. Schools are a tool available to those families to equip those children to be successful citizens and productive and have better lives than their parents. They are an important part of what parents can provide for their children. And having the choice to give a poor parent the option of putting their kids in the best possible environment is one of the best things we can do to be pro-family in America today.
Secretary Rice?
Well, I couldn't agree more, and I do believe that the education reform movement has picked up steam. And the people in this room are very much a part of it. But when you go out and you talk to people in the country, and sometimes I'll give speeches and it's about foreign policy, and someplace toward the end I will always say that to me the greatest national security threat that we face is the crisis in K-12 education, because without the ability of our kids to be educated, to find a job, we're going to tear ourselves apart as a country and we won't be competitive. That always gets the loudest applause. People know that we can't keep going the way that we are going. And so to the educational reformers in this room, many of you have been at the barricades for 20, 25, 30 years. I just want you to know that I think there is a groundswell and a movement coming up behind. I do think that the defenders of the status quo are on the defensive. They're on the defensive in the courts, as happened in California. They're on the defensive in the public relations. And now's the time to press the advantage and to make sure that every child gets the opportunity that's provided by education reform and school choice.
Yeah, and can I just add something? It's just 2 minutes and 30 seconds, and I'm a senator. Can I filibuster that? Or?
Absolutely.
I'll take a minute. I'll not 2, 3. Look, I just always important when we talk about these things not to leave here down. We do have challenges, but we're going to get this right for a couple of reasons. First of all, look at this event here today.
It's tremendous.
We are in this event here today with a collection of people that are criticizing what their government isn't getting right. There are a lot of countries in the world where they would have broken this meeting up a long time ago. Okay, so our freedoms are allowing us to do that. Our freedoms allow us to come together. We're going to argue about this. We're going to have a debate in this country, but we're going to get this right. I have no doubt about it. We have the freedoms, the intellectual curiosity, the innovative drive of our people, and we have to get it right. But I want everybody here to understand that the efforts that have already occurred, even as we speak tonight, there are children across this country that are doing the homework that was given to them today in a school they never would have been able to get to a decade ago. There are children in this country today that went to school in a place that would have been incredibly inaccessible to them just a decade ago. There are children in this country today that are having doors open for them that weren't open for their older siblings. And that has happened because of the effort of a lot of people in this room here tonight. And that's just in the last 15 years. We're going to get this right. We're going to have another American century.
Secretary Rice. One of the points raised by Senator Rubio was local government, local trust in terms of school reform. I think some critics would say, well, you know, you look at the outcomes, especially in some of those southern states, including your native state, and say, it hasn't been good. Why should we trust local government, state government even, with education reform?
Because people in Alabama and Louisiana and Georgia are starting to hold their state legislators accountable too. The idea that somehow the South is the old South where people are not able to petition and press their governments for better opportunity. It's just not true. If you go to my home city of Birmingham, where, by the way, Birmingham, Alabama, where Bull Connor was mayor and public safety commissioner, he was called, when I was a kid, that mayor's seat is now occupied by William Bell, with whom I went to 4th, 5th, and 6th grade at Brunetta C. Hill Elementary School, a segregated school in Birmingham, Alabama. So things have changed, right? Things have changed. And yes, localities have to be held accountable. State legislatures and governors have to be held accountable. But you know, they're closer to their people. Their people have means to hold them accountable, and they will. And so we have to trust the democratic process. And I just want to underscore something that Senator Rubio just said. You know, this is a democracy, the United States of America. But it only works if we work for it. It only works if we're determined to get the very best out of it, if we're determined to hold our elected officials accountable, if we're determined to hold our school boards accountable, if we're determined to hold our Congress and Senate accountable. But we have the opportunity to do that, and so this is in our hands, and I think we're going to be successful too. And I'm just sure that it is the American century that is before us, not behind us.
Please join me in thanking Secretary Rice and Senator Rubio, two education reform heroes. Thank you very much.